people continued to live in. And so the critiques, as we're going to see, the critiques of this type of mass culture always associated it with America, always associated with escapism, and always used the cinema audience, the mass nature of the cinema audience, the way in which people used to laugh in the same times, cry in the same times, whoop and hollow at the same time, as demonstrating the way in which cinema audiences had been turned in to an undifferentiated mass, that viewers had lost their individuality, that somehow films and the cinema had turned them into a unthinking and manipulable mass. Now, partly in order to protect the British cinema audience, and partly as a response to these concerns that American films, and I'm thinking particularly of gangster movies, of Western movies, of some of the sort of romance movies, seem to many British cultural observers to be, how do I put this, culturally debased. That is to say that they were predicated often around violence, and they were predicated often around a story of the American dream. You know, the triumph of one person, the story of an individual triumphing over adversity. In 1914, 25% of the films shown in the UK were British. By 1926, that had fallen to just 5%. Okay? British cinema goers had voted with their feet. They wanted to watch Westerns. They wanted to watch Chicago gangster movies. They didn't want to watch another British film set in a stately home with people talking in an accent that few of them could understand. Okay? They wanted actually American accents, not British aristocratic accents. But the quota was introduced, and it kept the British film industry alive, and it provided a critical training ground for many British directors, of course, most famously Alfred Hitchcock. But British films, the production companies were caught between heritage movies, you know, the stately home stuff, or literary adaptations, you know, another version of Wuthering Heights or Great Expectations. And all of the actors sounded like Hugh Grant. Well, actually, sounded like Hugh Grant on speed. I'm trying to think of the poshest English accent that you can imagine. Anyone give me an idea? The English actor or actress that you least understand because they talk with a terribly, terribly posh accent. Anyone give me a clue? No? Well, Hugh Grant will stand in there. Who?
Hugh Grant.
Hugh Grant's pretty good, isn't he? This led to the attempt by some people to try and produce a distinctly British type of movie. Okay? A movie that responded to these degraded American influences. And these are people like Graham Greene, the novelist, people like Joseph Priestley, a whole series of sort of left-leaning writers who suddenly start engaging in writing screenplays. So Joseph Priestley famously wrote the screenplay for this film I'm about to show you a clip of, by Gracie Fields, who is basically Britain's Greta Garbo, most popular female actress in Britain. And they wrote, the film is called Sing As You Go, Sing As We Go. It was filmed on location in Blackpool and released in 1934. And as you see, what the British type of film was meant to do was promote community, a story of a community, over the story of an individual. Okay, so so Gracie Fields gets laid off from the mill that she works in. The whole mill rally around trying to protect her job, and what I'm going to show you is the final scene of that, where she gets her job back and everybody is happy and the community is restored. There are many, many British movies which continue to work in this tradition. Okay? Continue to have a big, vast cast and try and tell not the story of an individual, but of a community and of the travails of a community. So here we go. Let's see if this works.
Oh, crumbs.
Is your name Grace Platt?
Yes, what's yours? Rin Tin Tin?
Well, I have a message for you and a letter from that young man you just saw off.
Get out.
His idea of a little joke.
Very funny.
He asked me to tell you that the Greyback Mill is reopening. Here's the letter.
Welfare officer. They want me to go back to the mill and bit welfare officer.
It must be potty.
What for you, Parkan? Do you think I can't do a job? You do it standing on my head.
Roadfield, Haywood, Castleton, Greybank, and Rochdale.
I'm off.
3 platforms at 11:30.
You're not leaving us, are you?
Yes, I am. I bet you're glad, aren't you?
Well, I wouldn't say I was, and I wouldn't say I wasn't, like, if you follow me.
I do, but don't you follow me.
Oh, I wouldn't.
No, a chance to be a fine thing.
Okay, you get the idea. There's only one Gracie Fields. Who can compete with her? Okay, so this film is importantly set in Blackpool, which is the leading seaside resort in Britain in the 20s and 1930s. It's where Mass Observation, the social research organisation you heard about last week, go to observe the Mass on holiday. Okay, the whole team go from Bolton, which they call Worktown, and follow people from Bolton to Blackpool. Blackpool is getting 7 million visitors per year by 1939, and it does so by this peculiar combination of pleasure rides. You can see the Ferris wheel in the back here, lots of high-tech modern fairground rides, and a very ample dose of the type of modern freak show. And it's this type of modern freak show that becomes for many people to stand in for the sort of debased instincts of mass commercial culture. Okay? So Mass Observation, read them, interpret them as a sign of the sort of primitive sexual taboos that continue to haunt modern civilization, continue to make the mass a race apart that needs scientific study. And just to be completely cheap, I'm going to give you 2 examples of these freak shows, okay, just so you get some sense of what people are doing at Blackpool. You see before you a picture of Colonel Leslie Ivor Victor Gauntlet Bligh Barker. Colonel Barker had an eating club for veterans of the First World War, was involved in on the fringes of fascist politics in the late 1920s, and hung out in boxing gyms and the like, basically existed in a world of hyper masculinity. But in 1929, he's declared bankrupt and taken to jail, where on medical inspection, he's found basically to have been born a biological female. Okay, so they take him to the women's prison, and they discover that Leslie Ivor Victor Gauntlet Bligh Barker had actually been christened Lilias Irma Valerie Barker. That would not have been a problem if the story had stopped it there. But the problem was the biological woman Barker had married a man in 1918 and had mothered a child. Okay, again, if the story stopped there, it would be just about okay. But in 1923, Colonel Leslie Ivor Victor Gauntlet Bligh Barker marries a woman, marries Alfreda Howard in 1923. Okay, and so had committed perjury in a church, had signed the marriage register as a man when that was not the case. So Barker was imprisoned. It was a big tabloid scandal. And after a decade of basically living on the margins and living under two other names, is basically continually broke, and accepts the offer of having a show in Blackpool. Okay, so in 1937, which is conveniently the year that mass observation turned up in Blackpool, that Colonel Barker is on show, and the show attracts something like 1 million people that season. The show depicted Colonel Barker and someone standing in for his wife, Alfreda Howard, in a pit on two beds. Between the beds was a pedestrian walkway, what in Britain we call a zebra crossing. And most importantly, as I've already explained to you, this is the era when traffic signals are being invented, and we had something called the Belisha beacon, which is a big flashing light on top of a pole that shows people that this is a pedestrian walkway. And of course, that object, the Belisha beacon, is a hugely phallic object with a flashing knob, if I can't put finer point on it, at the top. Okay, so the point of the story is Barker going to consummate the marriage by the end of the season? So people literally go in, walk around a glass cage to try and see whether these people are having sex, because the big scandal was, how did the wife, Alfreda Howard, not know that Colonel Barker was a woman? I mean, there are obvious answers to that question, which we can go into later. That's Freak Show 1. Freak Show 2 is the Reverend, the priest, the Anglican priest of a little village in Norfolk where people are slightly funny. The village is called Stiffkey. I'm from the neighbouring county, Suffolk, and we hate everyone in Norfolk. So for me, this story says a great deal about my once neighbours in Norfolk. So Stiffkey is a tiny little village in Norfolk, and the Anglican priest there is called Harold Davison. Harold Davison developed, shall we say, a penchant for saving fallen women in London's East End. He spends all of his time, apart from Saturday night and Sunday when he has to preach, in London in the company of prostitutes. The problem is that remarkably he gets found in this, shall we say, taking a little too much of a helping hand